Hi, this is Thomas from Apex Game Tools. In this video I'm going to go through the steer for unit avoidance component in Apex Steer. If you have not already watched the steering scanner video, I would suggest you watch that before you watch this. So steer for unit avoidance prevents units from colliding with other units outside of their own group. So let's have a look at the different options for this component. The first is the ignored units setting. As mentioned, units will by default ignore units in their own group, but you can set an attribute mask here to have them avoid, rather ignore, units of other types with this attribute mask. Next up we have the radius margin. This is the buffer between the unit and the unit it avoids, so that it will keep this distance between itself and the units that it avoids. In addition to, obviously, to its own radius. Next we have the minimum avoid vector magnitude. This is basically how low the avoid vector can be for it to actually be applied. So this is to avoid having too small avoid vectors and have jittery behavior. Next we have head-on collision angle. This controls what is considered a head-on collision. So by the default we have collisions where two units move toward each other at an angle between 175 and 180 degrees. This is considered a head-on collision. This does not control whether or not they will avoid each other. It simply controls how this avoidance is done. Head-on collisions, head-on collision avoidance is done slightly different from other types of collision. Next we have two options that control the behavior of the units. The first, Accumulator Vibrators, controls whether or not the unit will avoid multiple other units or just a single other unit. When it accumulates its avoid vectors, it will avoid all the units in its scan radius that it will collide with in the future. If this option is not on, the units will just avoid the closest unit with which it will collide in the future. So this results in slightly different behavior, as we will see in an example shortly. Now, if you do not have this option on, you will be required to have the scanner setting where it sorts units by distance enabled, so that the unit will be able to determine the closest units to itself. If you do have it on, it means that it will loop through obviously more units when it needs to avoid. It will have to take into consideration all the units that it will collide with in the future, but you will not have to sort units by distance on the scanner. So performance-wise, there's a difference there. You'll have to see what gives the best performance. Depends on the group size, but also it affects the behavior of the unit, so you will see what suits your needs the best. Next up we have prevent passing in front. If this is enabled, units will try to avoid units behind their velocity vector instead of in front of it. This only applies to units with a higher determination than the unit itself. So if the unit is trying to avoid has a higher determination, this unit will try to move behind the other unit when it avoids it. Determination setting, which can be found in the unit component, basically controls how units interact. So units with a higher determination will ignore other units with a lower determination with regards to unit avoidance and separation. So let's have a look at the different options here and how they look. So in this example seen here, we have 4 groups. On the right side we have 2 groups with accumulate vectors on, And on the left side we have two groups with accumulate vectors off. Let's see that in action. Now for same sized units the difference is subtle. But what it will do is that it will tend to, for units that accumulate their avoid vectors, they will tend to form lanes between each other, whereas those that do not will be more likely to interweave with each other. Let's have a look at an example with different sized units where the behavior will be more clear. So in this scene we have a group of big units at the top here, and at the bottom on the right hand side we have a group of units that will accumulate their avoid vectors, and on the left hand side we have a group that will not. So since there is a smaller gap between the bigger units, on the right hand side you will see, since they are accumulating avoid vectors, they will have a harder time actually finding gaps between the bigger units because they see themselves colliding with all three in the future. And on the left hand side, as you can see, they have an easier time to actually find a gap in between the bigger units because they only avoid the nearest unit at any given time. Now finally let's have a look at the prevent moving in front. So in this scene we have a row of red units with high determination, and then we have some smaller units at the bottom here that will try to move past these red units. Now all these units down here have the option to prevent passing in front, so they will actually try to pass behind these red units. Let's see that in action. So as you can see, the behavior basically causes units to brake and wait for the other units to pass by so that they can pass behind them. So that's it for unit avoidance. See you in the next video.